For the last couple of years, I've been aiming to read every day for a couple of hours, and for 2020 I made the New Year's resolution that I would read 50 non-fiction books. I try to read widely around all sorts of areas that interest me. I find that keeps me fresh, keeps me thinking about new ideas, new insights, all rather useful if you're going to produce a steady stream of content for other people, which of course is what I aim to do. Those books have fallen under 5 broad categories. 2 are to do with things past, biographies and history. Then we have science, we have politics and current affairs, and of course, other. Because there's always some things that don't fit neatly into a box. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to tell you what I read in each of those groups and then pick the one in that category that I most highly recommend. So let me tell you about my process. Whenever I see a reference to a book that sounds interesting or important, I add it to my digital to read pile. I use a random selection app on my phone to choose which will be the next book that I'm going to read. Right now, having read 50 books in 2020, I can tell you that there's almost 150 books still in that to read pile. So much to read, so little time. The value of selecting the next book to read at random is that before I did that, there would always be books that never made it to the top of the pile. Books that I know will be interesting, but when I'm thinking, what shall I read next out of all these things, there'd always be something else that would rise above those ones. But then when I do read them, often I'm really glad that I did. So the rule of a random selection is this. I can decide not to use it at all. I can decide to read a book that's just come out or that I want to research for a forthcoming video or whatever. But if I use the random selection app, which I do 3 times in 4, then the rule is that I have to read whatever comes out, whatever it is. It's a great way to avoid getting stuck in a rut, so long as there's good variety in the pile to begin with. All right, enough about that. Let's start with biographies. I've been working my way slowly through American presidents, rather slowly to be fair, so there's some evidence of that in this group. I read biographies of Cicero, of Isaac Newton, Otto von Bismarck. I read the autobiography of Margaret Thatcher. I read 2 biographies of President Andrew Jackson, not because I especially like Andrew Jackson, but just because the first one I read only dealt with his election campaigns, and I wanted a full life biography. I also read ones covering Presidents Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler. Seeing history through the eyes of individuals, of people, historical figures, one of the most compelling ways to come to understand it. Especially, actually, if you read about the same events but from different perspectives. So, following the biography of John Adams with one of Thomas Jefferson, for instance. In this case, though, the one that I most highly rated, and therefore my pick of this group, was the autobiography of Margaret Thatcher. These were events I saw unfolding myself with youthful eyes, and it was utterly engaging to get the retelling them all from Thatcher's point of view. In the early part of my adult life, I was surrounded by people who demonised Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party. Most of those people who are no longer really in my life still do demonise her and them. I don't remember ever doing that. I mean, my memory might be deceiving me in a way that it can do. But I've read biographies and autobiographies of political figures I both agreed with and disagreed with from the earliest days when I got interested in politics, which is probably why I reverted so easily to being a floating voter once I got out of involvement with it directly. Why I take the position that I do about seeing both sides and trying to find where the facts lie. Anyway, that's my pick. With the science books, there's a right old mix. We have Hacking Darwin by Jamie Metzl about genetics, The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs, Chaos by James Gleick, all about chaos theory, the clues in the name, The Human Side of Science, telling the story of the progression of science in the history of conflicts between some of the great scientists, all sorts of rivalries and petty disputes amongst the greatest thinkers of our time. The Hidden Life of Trees, a book that was recommended by the Eden Project founder Tim Smith, who I interviewed a while back. Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock, Nudge, which I talked about recently in a recent video, The Art of Statistics by David Spiegelhalter, The Transmission of Epidemic Influenza, Edgar Hope Simpson, and Energy Density by Vaclav Smil. A subset of science, of course, is to do with climate change. Although the climate books I've read this year have been as much about politics as the science, although I do read research papers in relation to videos all the time. Those ones have been Apocalypse Never by Michael Schellenberger, Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, probably my least favourite book of the entire 50 that I've read this year, and How to Think Seriously About the Planet by Roger Scruton. The science books I love the most are the ones that leave me with a massive sense of wonder at how fabulous the universe is. Genetics, Dinosaurs, Chaos Theory, and the book on trees all did that for me this year. My close second place pick, I think, is The Hidden Life of Trees. It's a book I would never have gotten around to reading if I didn't have the random selection system. But it completely opened my eyes to the fascinating complexities of how trees work, a whole new world, all the more magical because it's more or less right outside my door. And I never appreciated what's going on out of sight. How trees in woodland are connected together underground, how they communicate and support each other, the complex role that fungi play, all sorts of things. But my favourite one for the year is probably The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs by Steve Brusatte. It's a really engaging story, not just of the dinosaurs themselves, but also the process of how humanity slowly has learned their story from the scraps of evidence that we have available to us. And it gives you something of a sense of perspective over the timescales of millions of years, how new life reappears in the wake of old cataclysms. If and when humanity finally does blow it, whether that be in centuries or in millennia, it would be utterly fascinating to know what would arise again a million years later to fill in whatever niches have appeared. And it's my deepest frustration that I will never know the answer to that question. I have no problem with dying eventually. It's just that before I do, I want to learn everything there is to learn, to know everything about what came before and get to know everything that's going to follow. Might have to read more than 50 books a year. All right, third category, history. People who want to change the world, who know nothing of history, have very little chance except to repeat the mistakes we've already made, it seems to me. What is it they say? History doesn't repeat, but it does often rhyme. This year I've been reading history on China with Wild Swans by Yung Chan, A Brief History of China by Jonathan Clements, and Mao's Great Famine by Frank Dicotta. I've read about Genghis Khan and the great Mongol Empire that he created, which also includes a period of Chinese history with Kublai Khan. America, with These Truths by Jill Lepore and Empire of the Summer Moon. Daily life during the French Revolution, and then some focusing on specific periods across the West. Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, and Age of Capital, 1848 to 1875, by Eric Hobsbawm. And then some wider-ranging histories. Sapiens by Yuval Harari, and another one by Vaclav Smil, Energy and Civilization. Out of those, my second place goes to Smil for his Energy and Civilization book. I recommend it with an important caveat. You have to have a certain mindset to start a Vaclav Smil book. They go heavily into the very fine detail while being incredibly thorough and complete on whatever topic he's looking at. When I do my random selection thing and a Vaclav Smil book comes up, I brace myself and think, okay, I'm going in. And I know it's going to be deep immersion, probably for up to 2 weeks. And it will be fascinating, but quite hard work. They are fact-focused, non-ideological, the things that you know that I most like. And this one, which showed how much the development of civilization is really a story of energy, is really fascinating. Highly relevant context for where we are now. And it was the primary input for my video in praise of fossil fuels. But his books aren't for everyone. If you don't have the willpower to plough through often quite dry detail to get to the gold. So for that reason, my number one goes instead to Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. Genghis Khan was born into a Mongol world where deep-seated traditions and customs militated against, well, really any sort of successful progress. And the book shows really compellingly how he cast aside those unhelpful traditions, brought in meritocratic ways of working, exploiting the strengths that his people had, similarly exploiting the weaknesses of those who conquered. And in so doing, he created one of the most successful empires seen in human history. Now, of course, people think his name is just a byword for, indiscriminate raping and pillaging. And the savagery was a feature of the time, for sure. But what made him successful? It was things like military discipline, a willingness to spare the conquered and absorb them as equals into his own tribe, identifying all those with knowledge and skills amongst the conquered and actively learning from them, and encouraging the free flow of trade throughout the empire so that it was fed by increasing levels of prosperity, a principle we recognise now but was actually pretty revolutionary for the place and time. The empire he created endured for some time after his death. Ultimately, though, his heirs did not have his vision, his consistency or his discipline. The empire became more fragile, more corrupt, and then when plague struck, the trade routes specifically shut down, and without them the empire basically collapsed. Really interesting book, lots of lessons if you have the will to spot them. On to the politics and current affairs books. These included Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds, The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, How to Be a Conservative, Roger Scruton, Becoming, Michelle Obama, The Room Where It Happened, John Bolton, Irreversible Damage, Abigail Shrier, which I reviewed recently, excellent book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps by Ben Shapiro, and then 2 anti-BBC books, which came up almost in sequence by sheer chance from the selector. The Fake News Factory and The British Brainwashing Corporation. And then, because I felt like I should balance those by seeing the insider BBC view, I am reading right now, I'm finishing right now, Airhead by Emily Maitlis, the presenter of BBC Newsnight. Out of all of those, the BBC focused ones, both the pro and the anti, were probably the least interesting. Eric Hoffer's True Believer was hugely impressive and well worth a read. On the other end of the scale, John Bolton's account of his time at the heart of the Trump administration is both well told, but also deals with his subject pretty straight, I think. Hoffer gets my overall first place, though, I think. Really engaging review of what makes successful authoritarian movements, written at a time when Hitler and Stalin were extremely current examples. And then on to my remaining catch-all category of Other. These had a few business-focused books and a few self-improvement books. They were Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek, How the Mighty Fall by Jim Collins, Willpower Instinct, Kelly McGonigal, Principles, Ray Dalio, Stoicism by Thomas Beckett, Cooked by Michael Pollan, and, shock and horror, COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab, which you'll recall I discussed in a recent video as well. Out of those, Jim Collins' How the Mighty Fall was the most impressive. Collins is famous for big research projects into why companies or indeed organisations succeed, and in what circumstances, or in this case why, having been successful, they then end up collapsing. You can learn a huge amount about human organisations generally, as well as some things to inform your own approach to life from his books. And they are well written, based on solid research that goes to great pains to avoid preconceptions or bias, Well worth a read, even if you're not much into how businesses work. How the Mighty Fall documents how failed businesses went through a standard sequence that started with hubris, born of success, went from there to the undisciplined pursuit of more, then into denial of risk and peril as things clearly were going wrong, finally grasping desperately for salvation before capitulation. He gives lots of examples of how this has played out time and time again in practice, and he doesn't aim to show that similar processes can apply to a country or to political endeavours, but it's really hard to read it and not see a whole bunch of incredibly pertinent parallels. As for next year, I feel the need to up my game and commit to reading 75 books. And there's all sorts on the list waiting for me to get to them. More history, more science, more politics, more other. I will certainly be reading Barack Obama's autobiography and probably to balance one or two of the critiques of his time. I will certainly be reading on both sides of the climate science, or more often climate policy debate. If there was one philosophy I would recommend from, it's this. It would be to read widely beyond your immediate specialist areas of interest, and particularly read the books written by people on the other side to you on your issues of interest. If you're inclined to think badly of someone, well, read their books. You might find you end up empathising with them a lot more than you thought. If you don't, well, at least your view of them is now based on a deeper level of understanding. So, here's my question to you. What single book are you most looking forward to reading in 2021? What single book did you read in 2020 that you would most recommend to others? Put your thoughts in the comments below. And before I finish, time for me to select my next book. So let's just do that here now for the camera. So here's and I shake it to select. So here goes. And the book is Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. That will be my next book and my first one for 2021.